And he basically says, if you look at Europe today, the continent's in ruins. And what you have in Europe, he said, is a continent that's divided between wolves and sheep, the rich and the poor. And it's a continent in which the sheep are devoured by the rich. Those sheep are devoured by the wolves. And he said, if we don't have freedom of the press, a viable press system that everyone in the country has access to, can read and participate, that's what will happen here. That's our future. Inequality, corruption, exploitation is the natural byproduct of not having a viable press system. That's the #1 reason to have freedom of the press. That's Thomas Jefferson. Inequality, to battle inequality. Madison wrote much more about this than Jefferson did, and he made it quite clear. He argued, and Madison was a very learned man. He was classically educated. He's Greek and Latin he read. And he understood that the United States already in 1789 and 1792 was on the verge of becoming a dominant power in the world. And it would only be a short period of time until, if it wasn't the single most powerful country in the world, it would certainly be one of the 2 or 3 most powerful countries in the world. And he knew enough from history to know that once a country is that powerful economically, there are strong internal pressures to become an empire, to reach out, to militarize, to dominate the world, to increase your wealth and power. And he also understood that it was that imperial impulse that destroyed Athenian democracy and that destroyed the Roman Republic. And he was obsessed with that not happening in the United States. A lot of the reasons we have things like Congress has to vote for wars instead of the president being allowed to do it without congressional approval. Congress has to fund wars. The president can't just go ahead and do it. Was Madison's insistence to make it as difficult as possible for the president to start war. And Madison saw the press system as being the only protection we, the citizens, would have to prevent the government from becoming an imperial power. And he just thought it was just built into the logic of being a powerful and wealthy country. You're going to try to be an empire. And that the only thing we have that would save us would be a viable press system. And what happens when you have an empire, in his mind, is very clear. It invariably leads to increased inequality, increased corruption, secrecy, a loss of liberty. As he put it, no country can remain permanently at war and remain free simultaneously. Something has to give. So I think it's interesting if you look at why these guys thought freedom of the press was so important. Economic and social inequality, fighting militarism and imperialism. When you look at our press system today and look at arguably the 2 single weakest spots of contemporary American journalism, Madison and Jefferson hit the ball over the center field fence. And these guys just nailed it. It's exactly 1792, 2007. Their concerns are still our concerns. This is what we should be centrally concerned with in our press system today. So the media reform movement emerged because while the policymaking tended to be more democratic and out in the open in the first 50 years of the Republic, as these industries became more commercially lucrative, as new industries like the film industry, telegraph, telephone, radio, and then television and cable emerged, as to become billion-dollar industries, the policies and the monopoly licenses increasingly gravitated behind closed doors, getting no press coverage, not surprisingly, and as a result also people unaware of what was taking place. And what you had instead was a corporate system authorized by the government, created by the government, with enormous profits being made by a relatively small number of firms, and then at the same time you had elaborate public relations telling us this is the result of free markets giving us what we want. A complete disconnect from the reality that we faced. And I think that the whole point of the media reform movement was to address this corrupt policymaking process, to take the policymaking from behind closed doors, bring it out in the public, shine public attention on it, and force the policies to actually reflect the interests of the people of this country. That's the core founding principle of the media reform movement from the beginning. Now, when we started Free Press 5 years ago, approximately, a little less than 5 years ago, and not just us, but a number of other people working this issue, we were told it's impossible. This is the last thing people will care about. You can't organize on this issue. And we didn't know for sure if you could. I knew from my work, and Mark had the same experience because he was active in the 1990s with the Project on Media Ownership, is that when we would speak to audiences around the country, people were very interested in this. You know, there was no shortage of people who understood how central having a viable press system was, and they weren't getting it in the United States. So we always sensed there was actually much more interest in this than anyone acknowledged. The soil was pretty fertile. We weren't getting many people hurling tomatoes at us saying, we really love the status quo. Quite the contrary. But you just don't know till you get out and do it. So our job, basically, as I said, was to draw people into these debates, publicize them, make people aware, on the premise that if they're, hi, William, how are you? Good to see you. If they are brought before the public, we'll win. Good things will happen. They can't stand a public debate. We can't lose a public debate if it's fair and it's out in the open. But that still doesn't answer the question of why did this media reform movement happen now? Why not 20 years ago? The same argument really held 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, or 40 years ago. And this is where the subtitle of the book comes in, Critical Junctures. Because although the media system is the result of policies and subsidies continually from 1792 to the present, and they go up and down depending on the technologies and the policies and the subsidies, it's not like at any point in the process you can change course and have an entirely different media system. What I think history shows and history demonstrates, and what I argue in this book, is that there are moments in history, rare moments, that come only every 2 or 3 generations as a rule, in which the opportunities for the public to weigh in and change the course and rebuild the media system are much greater than at other times. The palette of alternatives is much, much greater. And it's at those moments people will get involved, can get involved, and really create a much different media system. And those moments I call critical junctures. And we're in one of those now, and I'll explain why in a second. But when you're not in a critical juncture, once your system is set in place, like you've established commercial broadcasting, you're what's called path dependent. You're really not going to get off that system for a while. The institutions are built up, the laws, the structures, the acceptance of it. But during the critical juncture is the opportunity society has to radically transform, for better or for worse, and recreate the media system. And what creates a critical juncture in media? What are the factors that lead to it? Well, I argue there are 3 core things that contribute to a critical juncture, a period which will last between 5 and 15 years, in which everything's up to grabs. The first one's pretty self-evident if you study media, technology. A radical new communication technology that upends the existing business of media, that makes the existing businesses no longer lucrative. They have to change how they do things. That forces sort of a reappraisal of how you're going to do media. The telegraph comes along. Well, how do you handle the telegraph? Who knows? It forces society to deal with this extraordinary technology. Telephone comes along, radio comes along, satellite comes along. New technologies that upend existing media systems require a rethink. If you think about media, almost all the major media are actually defined by the technology. I mean, the Post, that's not a good example. The press is a better example. Film, radio, satellite. The technology defines the medium itself. So, obviously today we have arguably as great a technological revolution as any in the internet and the digital communication. Even if someone loves the status quo is going away. There's no option. We can't stay stuck in 2007 or 1987. So things are going to change. How they're going to change is up to us. So the technology is one of the factors that contributes to a critical juncture. The second factor that can contribute to a critical juncture is that the content of the media is increasingly discredited or illegitimate. If there's widespread public disbelief and contempt for media content, and I would argue that we have that today, that journalism in this country specifically, but not exclusively journalism, but primarily, is at its lowest ebb in a century in many respects and is heading in the wrong direction. So we have 2 of the factors. And then the third factor that contributes to a critical juncture is when you have a broad period of social upheaval in society in which all the dominant institutions are being subject to criticism. And we have these in the United States every 30 or 40 years. The Reconstruction, the Progressive Era, the New Deal, the 60s. Periods in which there's just a much more critical gaze looking at all the major institutions in society. Now we have, in my view, all the objective conditions to have such a period of social upheaval in the United States today. Increasing inequality, militarism, corruption, stagnation. But we do not have the telltale sign of it, which is organized opposition that's effective. That's what's missing to really make that kick into place. We've got 2 out of 3 now, which is enough to have a critical juncture, but it's really having that third element, broad politicization and involvement and critical review of all institutions. If we had that, then this critical juncture would be at a whole different level, and our range of options that we have as a society would be much greater than they are currently, although they are still greater now than they would normally be in years where there were not a critical juncture. Okay, does that make sense? So I'm sort of compressing. Now you still got to buy my book, but I'm compressing like 2 chapters into like 2 minutes. To give a little bit of history on this to make sense of when we've had critical junctures in the past, some of the famous ones. The Progressive Era is a classic moment of a critical juncture in American history. In the Progressive Era, it wasn't that it was technologically driven as much as you had such heavy concentration of ownership of newspapers in the United States by the 1900 to 1915 that you had 1 and 2 newspaper towns almost everywhere in the country, except in the large cities like New York or Philadelphia or Chicago. And the press at that time had no illusion of being anything but partisan. And it was stridently pro-business, stridently anti-labor. And it was also